Good evening, everybody. I'm not sure how to get myself in the middle of the screen. I don't know if I should move. But good evening, and welcome to those of you who have joined us online. I'm going to try and get started quite quickly. We're lucky enough to have Mr. Schmit with us here today. I'll just say a word of welcome. This is the last group meeting this year. We tend to have a small gathering, a party at the end of the year. Very often we have karaoke. No, I jest. That's just for a select few. In any case, this is the last plenary session. It's going to be very busy indeed. We hoped to be able to meet not as political androids, as it were, but as people. But we haven't cancelled anything. We're just postponing our festivities, and hopefully we can celebrate Christmas in the middle of next year. As you'll have seen on our agenda, we're lucky enough to have Commissioner Schmit with us, and we'll be able to have an exchange of views with him, followed by an exchange of views with the Sakharov Prize finalists at 7:30. I won't take any more of our time up. Mr. Schmit has already appeared here in our group, but we hadn't had the Commission's proposals on the minimum wage at that stage. We have had some more detailed information which we can base our discussions on since then. And then we have the calendar for 2021. Once again, it's going to be a very full year for you as a Commissioner. We have great expectations about platform workers' minimum wages and the way in which the Commission will be able to tackle the social crisis, which is going to last a lot longer than the health crisis and have considerable repercussions for everybody. So I think our hopes and expectations are even greater than they were before. No pressure, of course. But we expect a lot of you for 2021. Social issues lie at the very heart of our group's beliefs, and I know you're familiar with our MEPs in Ample. They've already expressed their views here today, but we try and take this same social approach across all committees to Econ, ITRE, Inter, Brexit. They really are cross-cutting issues. We'll have the opportunity to talk to you now. Perhaps you'll take a gentle ribbing as well, because we are a family and families can take the mickey sometimes as well. So we have a working group, a strategic working group on the rights of workers and social rights that they have organized amongst themselves about who's going to take the floor. If others wish to take the floor, please do add your name to the list. We will try and manage our time as well as possible. I'll keep an eye on the clock, but before then I will give the floor to Nicolas Schmit, and then I'll say a couple of words about how we will organize the speaking time. Firstly, thank you very much indeed for joining us just before the holidays. It's very much appreciated. Let me reassure you that we welcome you here with a great deal of friendship and confidence, and we know that this will be we will be proved right in the future. Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair. It's a great pleasure to join you here tonight. I've noted we've got an awful lot on our plate for this meeting. Very important topics which strike right to the heart of the current social context, the issue of wages. This was something of a priority before the crisis, but it is more and more pressing today. Today, during the crisis, and as you say, after the crisis. The Commission, before the crisis struck, made a commitment, and before this Parliament was even elected, the Commission was clear that they were committed to a framework for minimum wages, which would allow a decent lifestyle for all workers. This commitment has been retained. Now, you may well say that we haven't gone far enough. I've already heard that. Let me tell you, I've heard that on several occasions. Perhaps I personally would have liked to have gone a little further. But we have a treaty which sets out the responsibilities and competences, and this goes for wages as well. A number of member states, and I believe there are representatives of these member states in your group, have called on the legal services of the Council, questioning whether or not we had already overstepped our legal competences, or whether the legal basis was the correct one. Of course, the Commission is convinced that we have indeed chosen the correct legal basis, and that we have indeed stayed within the limits of our competences. The legal basis you are more than familiar with. It's the article which talks about working conditions and the lives of workers, talking about living conditions for workers. You simply cannot ignore one of the key criteria which helps shape workers' lives. So I think the legal basis is the correct one. Others believe, looking at the Court of Justice's opinions, seem to see eye to eye with us now, and I'm delighted to see that. So that's the legal basis. However, at the same time, there is an article or a paragraph in Article 153.5, if I'm not mistaken, which says that we do not have the right to set wages. The Commission, the European Union, does not have the right to set wages. So on the one hand, we have the possibility, the option to create a framework for minimum wages. At the same time, we cannot go to the extent of fixing limits or thresholds for wages. Against that backdrop, we have tried to negotiate the legal restrictions, because if we went any further, we would be exposing ourselves to the risks of being of running up against the legal opinion of the Council services, or even we would find ourselves in court. On the basis of subsidiarity. So that's the backdrop. So what have we done? The goal of this directive is to encourage member states to set minimum wages which allow for a decent lifestyle, with the end goal of ensuring economic and social convergence. For us, economic convergence, more than this, social convergence, is extremely important. Because if you look at the differences in terms of salaries or wages across the member states, there's a considerable gulf from one end to the other. So we have called for integration, looking at those who are members of the EMU. Economic integration is to be encouraged, as is social integration. And there was considerable progress to be made in terms of wages. If we're going from 1 to 5, a country I'm very familiar with has a minimum wage 7 times higher than, well, I'm not going to name the countries here, but of course Bulgaria has the lowest minimum wage. So that's the gulf which is separating the highest from the lowest. And we want to encourage the quickest possible social convergence based on minimum wages. Now, how can we do this? Firstly, we have to encourage member states to take a look at, with the help of objective criteria, the minimum wages and encourage them to adjust them on the basis of this criteria. That's where we have this article which sets out the criteria set by member states. Now, I've been asked, why didn't you call for an average or median wage? Well, of course, we have included this information. It's one of the indicators. A median wage is mentioned in the recitals, but also in the article in question. But if we focused solely on this criteria, we would have come across two problems. Firstly, indirectly, we would have been fixing wages. If we say you need a 60% minimum wage, 60% of your median wage, you could say for Bulgaria, for example, this would have worked. Member states would be invited to calculate their own median wage, but this would have meant a binding obligation on member states to set a minimum wage. So we can encourage member states along that path, but we cannot force them to set a certain threshold. Secondly, and it seems something of a paradox, the countries which are closest to the median tend to have the lowest wages. And why is this? Well, because in these countries there's a large share of the labor force which actually earns the minimum wage, which pulls the median wage down, which means that the median wage is very close to or exactly the same as the minimum wage. So if you call on member states to respect the median wage and use their minimum wage as a percentage of that, they say, well, that's actually lowering the minimum wage. So we're absolutely fine. We don't have to take any action at all because we're already at that level. However, trade unions within these countries really discouraged us from focusing on this indicator. In Hungary, for example, the minimum wage is hovering around the minimum wage. The median wage as it is in Bulgaria and a few other countries, they would have seen that as an incitement just to do nothing and sit back and stick with the status quo. Then there are member states which don't have a legal minimum wage. So in these countries, setting of wages is based solely on collective bargaining. Now, you will be aware, you have colleagues in your group, and I've discussed this issue with them at length, and they don't like it when we get involved with wages, especially when that steps on competences on wage issues, and I put that in inverted commas because they believe, and I think wrongly, they believe that the Commission will get involved in their national systems and help fix wages and salaries which should be based in their system solely on collective bargaining. Now, on the first point, I fully agree. Collective bargaining is the best way, is the right way to set wages. So in Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Italy, to a certain extent, wages are set by collective bargaining, and around 70 to 98% are covered in this way, and I think Austria is really leading the field here. So I fully understand that these member states have said we don't want to take that risk. We don't want to find ourselves with a binding minimum wage which will not allow us the flexibility we want. Our wages, our salaries are set by collective bargaining, full stop. So the main concern of these countries, I forgot Finland. In fact, Finland is one of these. The situation is a little bit different there, but The main concern is that once we have a directive which dictates a binding minimum wage, at a certain point, the ECJ will force us to introduce a minimum wage, which we do not want. And when we say we, this is the government and political parties across the spectrum, from the far left to the right, employers. They spoke out very forcefully against this idea, and also trade unions. So we took these concerns on board, which is why the first article says there are two systems in Europe. We have countries with a legal minimum wage, with wages negotiated by collective bargaining as well. And then other countries, the second group, which works solely on the basis of collective bargaining. So we need to respect these systems. Collective bargaining must be respected, but we cannot leave it there. We want to protect these systems. This is why there are provisions in the first article. I mean, you're handing over the text. It's in English, unfortunately, but I mean, they're not used to me speaking French, so. Ever since the UK left, everyone speaks English around here, it seems. So there is a provision which says, based on this directive, there is no obligation to introduce a legally binding minimum wage. And the requests were submitted by some countries which had this system. There was no obligation to adjust or amend the collective bargaining systems which exist in countries like Finland and France as well, in parallel to this minimum wage. So we worked on the basis of a collective bargaining system because we believe that unless Europe as a whole is calling for a social market economy, wages should be determined by collective bargaining between social partners. In reality, some countries do use this method, but many countries have a very low level of coverage, between 20 to 50%, and in Germany, others. I think there are 17 countries who fall below the 70% level for collective bargaining, and 10 countries above that. France, of course, is above that threshold. There's a lot of collective bargaining there. So we wanted to use this text to promote social dialogue and encourage collective bargaining. Member states are invited to set out action plans together with their social partners to call and encourage collective bargaining. I think it's something of a paradigm shift, because when I think about what the situation was a few years ago, we were discouraging certain member states from encouraging collective bargaining, and now we tried to almost to encourage them to unpick their systems based on collective bargaining. We're doing the opposite here. We believe that collective bargaining is the right approach. And it's worth pointing out that the President of the Commission is very attached to this notion of a social market economy and really believes the social partners have a key role to play. We're not naive. We know there won't be a change overnight, especially in those countries where the social partners do not have as much power as or visibility as in others. So what we're doing now is working on promoting social dialogue, reinforcing the position of social partners, especially in those countries where they find themselves, perhaps for historical reasons or others, they find themselves somewhat in the shadows. So that's one angle we have to approach the question from as well. How can we promote the social dialogue model and promote our social partners? Now, how are we going to implement this directive, member states need to have an idea of what has been done in the past on minimum wages and what is being done now. There is a system of annual monitoring which will be carried out with an annual report and checks to determine where the evolution of the minimum wage. Exceptions, exemptions, derogations should be kept to a minimum. That's an important part of our work, because a number of member states do have a minimum wage which doesn't apply across the board. There are a number of exceptions, and we have to try and flush those out. Secondly, we have to bear in mind criteria such as broad evolution of wages, and here we're sticking quite closely to the median, but also the cost of living, because our goal, after all, is that we want to do away with the notion of the working poor. People should not be working full time and yet find themselves unable to pay their bills at the end of the month. So that is the logic that ran through our work. How can we implement this directive? How can member states implement this? It's not going to be easy, I won't pretend it is, but given the legal restrictions we have and the scope of our ambition, we want to make this a key part of social and economic policy, because it, as we've said, it's part of economic policy, but as we have seen during the crisis, I read recently what the German minister said about minimum wages and low wages as a whole. We need to ensure that wages are adjusted upwards in the way out of this crisis. So that's just a few words on the logic and the philosophy behind our proposal. I didn't say everything I had to say. I'm sure I've forgotten something, but the chair, I'm sure I have the opportunity to add those in later. But you seem to have focused on the minimum wage there. That's the Commission's flagship policy in this area. I know there'll be a number of questions on this. I suggest that we have 45 minutes left. I know you'll have to leave at 7:30. What I suggest is that we take groups of 3 questions at a time, 2 minutes maximum per question, and then Mr. Schmit can take the floor to answer. We'll stop every 3 questions so that Nicolas Schmit is able to answer each and every question. Do you agree with that? Leila, take the floor. Yes, just on procedure. I think we'd sent in written questions on other issues as well, other issues, not just the minimum wage. Yes, indeed. For those of you who are part of the strategic working group, Leila, you are. The group drew up a list of questions which he sent to Mr. Schmit. If I understand correctly, he wanted to make his introductory questions on the minimum wage. But I am sure that you will be able to come back to the questions on platform workers. Unless, Mr. Schmit, do you want to say anything now on the other issues, or perhaps you'd prefer to answer the questions? Well, we have spoken on these matters at length beforehand, Madam, the proposals that we have for platform workers. The legislation that should govern the work of platform workers. As I said to you before on other occasions, the Commission has adopted a plan on the digital economy. The rules, competition issues, economic questions, the issues of competence, and in the second stage, towards the end of the year, we will be publishing a proposal on the social angle as well, that is protection of workers and their rights, platform workers. If you have a specific question, then I can go into more detail on that. But please bear in mind, we're just at the beginning of this process. We had an exchange of views here in the Parliament on this matter. We are now consulting the social partners, as we must according to the treaty, and we're gathering evidence and information and proposals which have been made by the different parties. The second point I wanted to bring up is that this year we have the action plan for the implementation of the Pillar of Social Rights. That's a very important moment, a milestone really, for social Europe. And it has sketched out the route which we'll be taking over the next 10 years. On the basis of the pillar, we should have an idea of how we are going to implement the principles, how, with what goals in mind. There's an awful lot missing at the moment, of course. The minimum wage is one of them, because I think the pillar, principle number 5, mentions minimum wages. So we will have an action plan, as announced by the President of the Commission, looking at the implementation of the Pillar of Social Rights. We hope to hold a summit on social Europe in the light of the digital and green transitions. This will be held in May in Porto. And the action plan will be structured much in the way that the Pillar of Social Rights was. So that's our work program in a nutshell. I know you will be voting on the Parliament's report, preparing the groundwork for the Porto Summit. This is an important document. And I must congratulate the rapporteur for the high quality of his work. It covers a lot of ground, a lot of issues. As we said, social dialogue, collective bargaining. So that's going to be perhaps the second milestone in our work on the social agenda. So the action plan, which won't be limited to our mandate in the next 4 years. We hope to take it at least to 2030 with a number of very concrete proposals to implement these principles. Thank you very much. Leila, you'll have the opportunity to ask more detailed questions as well. I have a speakers list which was agreed upon by the Strategic Working Group. Firstly, Özlem, Nicolas, Sandra, Leila, Marc, Maria Rena, Jose Costas, and one more name which the interpreter missed. If you also want to take the floor, please add your name to the list. I suggest you have 2 minutes each. 3 questions to start with, so that Nicolas Schmit has the opportunity to answer all the questions. If I've done my sums right, then we'll have 2 minutes per question, 5 minutes for the replies. That's 4 rounds of questions. Unless there are other requests for the floor. If there are, then please let us know as soon as possible. With that, I give the floor to Özlem. We don't have a clock or a countdown here in the room, but I will use the timer on my phone. So much like in plenary, I will cut you up after 2 minutes so that everybody in our group has the opportunity to speak. Özlem, you have the floor.
Dankeschön, Manon. Dankeschön.
Thank you very much, Manon. Thank you very much, and it's very nice to have this opportunity to speak about this particular issue. Of course, we are fighting for better labor conditions, and your proposal is in the right direction, but as said, it is not sufficient. Now, of course, we as a group are on the side of unions, and we want to push forward as far as the further strengthening of labor rights. Now, the ETUC has made a number of important proposals, but of course there is a lot left for the Commission to do to meet the various demands of the ETUC. Now, as far as the defense funds, I think indeed we have to look at these very closely and compare them to what is in the text as far as collective bargaining. So we need to have a clear set of rules. Perhaps you could present to us what the various conditions in these new labor agreements would be, how these would affect remuneration. And I think it's very, very important for us to have a clear idea as far as unions, what the rights will be, the right to enter unions, to unionize, in other words, and that particular guarantee has to be in place, that laborers have the right to unionize. And I do feel as well that, Mr. Schmit, that a lot of this must be linked to the European semester. With the austerity policy of the past, we had a decoupling of these particular issues. So I think the Recovery Fund, once again, will have to be closely linked into all of these issues in order to make it truly something robust.
Thank you very much, Özlem. You stuck to the time, to the second. Özlem will be our shadow rapporteur on the minimum wages report, just so you're aware. I'll now give the floor to Nikolai, who you'll be familiar with. He's our EMPL coordinator. Nikolai.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for coming to our group. As I think we all agree, it's extremely important to end in-work poverty, but as we also know, there are differences between the different labor market models in the different countries, and what works in one country might not work in another country. And as the Commissioner knows, there are still a great concern for the Nordic model and what consequences the directive will have. And therefore I have three questions. First, I'd like to ask if it's the Commissioner's understanding that Article 1, Paragraph 3 of the directive allows member states in which wage setting is primarily set by way of collective bargaining and where there is no statutory minimum wage to derogate from the purpose of the directive. Secondly, in Article 3, Paragraph 5, it is unclear if the Commission is referring to a national level of 70% of coverage of collective agreements, or if the level is meant to be calculated sector by sector. So I would like to know if the Commissioner thinks that the definition should be according to national or sectorial level. And third and finally, I would like to hear from the Commissioner if he can describe in details what should happen if the level of coverage of collective bargaining falls below 70%, including what an action plan could consist of, and in case that this plan does not work, if the Commission would then consider putting forward specific demands for the member states. I think that was within the 2 minutes. Thank you.
Exactly 2 minutes. Thanks, Nikolai. Then we move on to Sandra, who's the vice chair. She's not connected. Okay. Well, then Sandra will be for later. Then moving on to Malin, staying in the north of Europe, if you're connected, Malin.
Yes, I am. Sorry. Hello. Yeah. Welcome to our group, Commissioner. Nice to see you, even though virtually. It's as if Nikolai has asked some of the precise questions that you would imagine come also from me. I'm from the Swedish Left Party. I do recognize that the intention is, of course, not from the Commission to break something that is working extremely well. But that is de facto the assessment that everyone makes in Sweden. And I say everyone because it's, you know, from right to left, and also trade unions as well as employers associations. So it's a model that has delivered the best real wage increases in Europe. So it's really a model that has proven itself. It's at the core of the Swedish welfare state also, I would say. And to even think that the Commission would go in and break that is, of course, something that we cannot accept. So my question, one of the question is that our parliament has, as the Danish parliament said, that this is not within your remit to legislate about. So we expect the legal services of the council to look more closely at this now. Do you have a plan B for this if it comes forward that there is actually a problem of legal basis? And the second question is also, and I think it's a very important issue and the signal to give. And the second issue that I wanted to ask is whether, I think Nikolai covered the other questions that I had with the specific demands. So thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Malin.
Thank you very much, Malin. I'll give you the floor now, Commissioner. You can see that there are differences of opinions even within our group. There are views from the north of Europe, views from the south, views, really across the spectrum.
The first question. Of course, the agreements have to be respected. If the Commission's proposals are not respected, or if those particular agreements are not respected, then of course it won't work out. When we don't have respect for these particular treaties or agreements, then there's nothing really much to do. And some are trying to do that. Some are trying to do that, but with posting, for example, two countries. The particular issue of posting has been taken to the ECJ, for example, and there have been a number of different problems there. But that's why we have, so that we don't need a plan B, we have looked very, very closely and taken into consideration the necessity of working within the framework of the treaties and agreements. Now, this particular directive, to extend it to unions and entering unions and that particular right, of course, this would change the spirit of the particular text, and things would be based on agreement, or on, if you like, coming in line with the unions. It would have a slightly different nuance, if you like, if this particular issue were brought into the scope of it all. So that's why we've kind of balanced all of this out with the qualifying issues. Of course, with regard to democratic rights, of course, that is guaranteed by the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And that is an issue, indeed. That is an issue. And it all, of course, pertains to the realm of the rule of law. But I do feel that within the framework of the European semester, and on the basis of scoreboards, and thereafter the directive, now, one can speak about better salaries and wages, and this is something that has been done in the past as well in certain member states. Not long ago, certain member states where there are very, very low salaries and wages. Well, I think here the directive offers more possibilities, and that's all within the framework of the recovery, the scoreboard, the semester, and on the issue of labor market models, now in English.
Scandinavian or Nordic, but I think it's more Scandinavian labor market model, because I've heard that the Finnish government has expressed its support for this directive. So the Nordics are not a homogeneous bloc, as nowhere there's a homogeneous bloc. So on Article 1, derogation. No, there is not a full-fledged derogation, because that would be also a problem, a legal problem. Because if it said there's a derogation, those who have a system based on exclusive collective bargaining, they have a derogation. They have nothing to do with this directive. This directive is broader than just the statutory minimum wage. But there is a derogation on the particular issue of statutory minimum wage, because the directive in, where is it, Article 1.3 says, nothing in this directive shall be construed as imposing an obligation on the member states where wage setting is ensured exclusively via collective agreements to introduce a statutory minimum wage, nor to make the collective agreements universally applicable. That's a clear derogation for this particular point in the directive. National level 70%. Well, if the national level of coverage falls under 70%, there is no legal consequence for that. That does not mean that the Commission has the possibility, on the basis of this proposal, to say now you're under 70% and you have to introduce a statutory minimum wage. There's nothing in this text which refers to that. So it's just to say then, if this happens in those countries where that are above 70%, by the way, it's the national average, not the sectoral one, then they should reflect if their wage setting system is as efficient as it was in the past, because that means that a lot of people are not covered by collective agreements. There might be a problem, including for the trade unions. There are countries, Germany, where trade unions were against statutory minimum wage, and when the coverage fell under 50 or around 50%, suddenly they changed their mind, because there were more and more people who were not covered anymore. But that's then an issue in the country, how wage setting is organized, and not a competence of the union. Coverage, so that's intent, yeah, the plan B, no, I am convinced that we are right, that our legal base is right. But I must say, I have a lot of understanding for the concerns. But once the text is on the table, and you can read this text, and you can really read it as it is expressed here, I start not understanding anymore the concerns. Because then you give always the same arguments you gave before. But before I could understand it, because there was no text. Now we have a text. So I want to hear the arguments, why there is this assessment that this could destroy or change or whatsoever, topple the good model based on collective bargaining. I must say, I've not, it's always the idea, well, one day the court will come and tell us. No, the court is part of the legal system of the union. And the court does not stand above the legal system of the union. The court has to respect legal text as this directive. So this is an argument I really start not to accept it anymore. So please, I understand. Well, I understand Business Europe that they do not like this text. I understand that. Yes. Why should they? But sometimes I wonder how, when you agree with fair wages everywhere in Europe, not just in those who have the good system, everywhere, well, then you have to reflect on how we can improve the situation. This directive tries to give an answer to that.
Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner. We'll move on to the next round of questions. We'll change the topic somewhat. Our different speakers will move on to different subjects. I have Leila, Mark, and Maria Eugenia. Starting with Leila, who's here in the room with us. Thank you, Manon. Thank you, Commissioner. I will try and keep it as brief as possible. I know you're going to cut me off after 2 minutes, Manon. Indeed, we have discussed the issues of platform workers in the past. I have a specific question, even if there are consultations about the scenarios you have set out, on the 30th of November in an EMPL committee, you said that in your opinion we shouldn't take up the question of the protection of platform workers from a point of view of their status, their statute. And this is something you repeated before the ministers across the EU. Now, when you're talking about the statute, you're saying we stick to the status quo. That means they're independent workers, freelancers. Does that mean we need to give more rights, protection to independent workers at the moment? That is social protection, the right to collective bargaining. If that's the case, then fine. The problem is, at the moment, we're not solving the problem of the inferior status that exists for platform workers compared to workers. I mean, they're independent workers, they're freelancers, but they don't have the same rights as protections as other workers. So how do you see things unfolding? I think there are two possible scenario bases to resolve this issue. Either we ensure that platform workers are truly independent workers, or we make them employees. That means we have to adjust platforms, regulate them to ensure that they no longer have the right over their workers, which they don't have over independent workers. If we then label platform workers employees, then the platforms themselves would have to respect certain rights and obligations. So there is a question of status there as the statute. I really want to know specifically, how do you suggest we solve this problem? What are the most likely scenarios we will be heading for in the future? Thank you very much, Leila. 2 minutes on the dot. Next, Marc.
Francophone, ou peut-être, je ne sais pas si tu vas parler en français ou pas, Marc.
Bah oui.
Well, of course I'm going to speak French. I was delighted to see that the Commissioner spoke French, so I will do so as well. Thank you very much indeed for your explanations. As Manon asked us to move to a different topic, I was wondering whether you had any scoops on European social security issues, because, as you know, in the light of negotiations ongoing, it will be interesting to know where the Commission stands on this point. Then, coming back to minimum wages, firstly, in principle, I can support the instruments chosen and support you in your views that in the EU we do need movement in this area. Something which you could bring up with your colleagues is that collective bargaining is important, but with collective action, then it's just a collective deception. And in Belgium, there are trade unions who are being prosecuted for their activity in this area, and that's something which we need to look at. Criteria, productivity, the evolution of productivity. This worries me somewhat. You'll be aware there is considerable decoupling here. Wages have a delay of about 20-30% compared to productivity. So how are we going to assess this? I don't think there should be that link up between the productivity and wages in the criteria. And then the non-regression clause. What is the true scope of this clause? Namely, in the light of other criteria, does this just mean that we can't invoke the directive to lower minimum wages, or is it designed to have another impact elsewhere? I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you, Marc. You two stuck to the time limit. We'll move on to Maria Eugenia.
She's not connected? Okay, then José, if you're connected? Neither. So I suggest you answer those two questions by the time we get them online.
Sur le statut, j'ai dit.
On the statute, if we were to use this as a starting point for our discussions, we would very quickly come embedded in very complicated issues. For example, the status of the worker. We have seen that very often it's the same member states who do not agree with the definition of worker. So if we take that as our starting point. Is a worker an employee? Now, very often I think a worker is an employee, but there are platforms where the workers aren't employees at all. They clearly aren't. So yes, we do have to work out what status they have. If we were to say that all platform workers are employees, we would find ourselves faced with very complicated problems indeed. So we have to find a method, and I don't know what this method will be. I hope we will be able to come up with it. So there are member states who have tried to come up with a definition or a method to identify the appropriate statute. Unfortunately, in California, the law was revoked. There's an awful lot of money at stake. You can see that as well. But if you say we'd start with that discussion, well, I want all platform workers to have social rights. That goes without saying. We're working on the right to collective bargaining. Madame Vestager is in charge of that, saying even if they are independent workers, they should have the right to collective bargaining. So that would be watering down their statute to a certain point. But then whatever their statute is, they need social protection, health care, protection from and recourse in case of accidents, for example. So I think we have to perhaps turn the question on its head, because there are platform workers who want to be self-employed. So we would have to look at what criteria would apply to determining the status of platform workers. If they are clearly subordinate to the platform, then they are obviously employees. But if, as you said, there's no point setting up an artificial third status, a third statute, because, I mean, that's a no-go area. But we can't spend the next 6 years discussing whether or not they are employees or self-employed, because we've had considerable problems just determining the definition of worker. Yes, we are going to continue working on this. We will try and draw up a list of criteria, but our goal was to provide the protection to platform workers regardless of their status, whether they are self-employed or employed. Social Security number, the European Social Security numbers. I am very familiar with this issue. The Commission is committed to producing proposals as soon as possible to try and make progress on this file, which has unfortunately ground to a halt. I want to reopen this question under this commission. I think it would ensure mobility and fair access to the rights of all workers and allow them to access their right to mobility. On productivity, well, you provided the answer to your questions. Wages should reflect productivity, and that's not the case. There is indeed a delay in wages. We do need to ensure they are truly coupled. And I think that's a good argument, by the by, for member states who have very low wages, very low minimum wages. They say if you increase wages or increase minimum wages, the problem is whether increasing these wages, this is not reflected in an increase in productivity or an increase in the cost of living. So yes, productivity does have a key role to play. We need to ensure that wages are aligned with productivity. If this is done correctly, then we will find ourselves in a position to make the appropriate calculations. No, the non-regression clause, of course, we're not going to ask member states with higher minimum wages to lower them, especially those countries who are adept at collective bargaining. I think it's upward convergence. That's the whole point of social Europe, and this is spelled out in the treaties. Thank you very much, Commissioner. We'll continue with the next round of questions. José and Costas. I hope that works. José.
Then we're going to move to Costas. If you're connected, Costas. Yes, perfect.
Yes, Manon.
Thank you. Thank you, Manon, and welcome, Commissioner. I'm very, very glad indeed that I see you.
Very nice to see you here.
Η συνάντησή μας, μια δήλωση που είχατε κάνει εδώ στην ομάδα μας, στο Στρασβούργο ήταν, αν θυμάμαι καλά, για την Deutsche Telekom, έπαιξε πολύ σημαντικό ρόλο στην Ελλάδα και οι εργαζόμενοι στην Deutsche Telekom στην Ελλάδα, στην Κοσμοτέ, ΟΤΕ.
And indeed, it was something very important. So this was a very, very positive development indeed, the statements with regard to Deutsche Telekom. Now, with regard to the basic wage, I read the text very, very carefully. First of all, I agree that we do have to establish that. We're one of the countries of the South. We need things like this. Now, I disagree with the sufficient wage. It ought to be just wage. And this particular word is of great meaning indeed. The example of Bulgaria, fine. Well, we, however, are in the Eurozone. So how can it mean something in a Eurozone country, and how can it mean something different in a non-Eurozone country? And I would like to say, I do feel that the European Union, we have a historic opportunity right now to legislate in a new reality. And the question is how we are going to manage this new productive environment. Are we going to legislate with logical things like fewer working hours per work, protection of jobs, equal pay rather, collective bargaining? I am in agreement with your particular view. You feel are on the right side of things. We have to protect the labor force. There's no question about that. And we have to protect workers on platforms as well. And here I feel that we have to support a model which is truly European of nature, of a different approach altogether, because I do feel that the generations to come will experience something totally different with what we've experienced.
Et ensuite,
Thank you very much indeed, Costas. I hope that José is there. No?
No. José, if you hear us, you can try to refresh your page and reconnect maybe. Hopefully we'll get you. Et en attendant, je vous repasse la...
In the meantime, I'll give the floor back so you can answer Costas' question.
Je me félicite que...
Well, I'm delighted that European businesses are allowed to operate in countries where they don't have their headquarters. And they're able to use the rules which apply in their country of origin. So we're in a learning phase at the moment. Other European companies who come from countries which respect the right to collective bargaining, when they operate in other countries, often they forget these rights. So I think that's great. We need to nudge companies towards collective bargaining and perhaps set a certain pressure on these businesses and encourage investment in these policies wherever they operate. Of course, I'm in favor of a fair wage.
In the, I'm sorry, I should have answered in English, but what we are saying, promote adequacy with the aim to achieve decent working and living conditions, social cohesion, and upward convergence. Well, even just, you know, if you have to define just, it's not so easy. I think it's very clear that people should, we have certain criteria, and here the indicators also of poverty and so on can help us to define what an adequate wage should be, or just wage if you prefer. Now on artificial intelligence and the platform economy. Well, I think nobody is against in principle against the platform economy. The point is that the platform economy has to respect the same social and other rules, by the way, because there is an issue not just about social standards, there is also an issue about controlling. I think this is a real issue. Now, as I said today, the Commission has adopted a certain number of really, I would call it revolutionary measures for the platforms. The big platforms, to protect citizens, but also, in a way, workers. And this is the question of controlling, because the guys on the platforms, the poor guy who was running for Uber or Deliveroo or whatever, he is not just working without any or a lot of social protection. He's also a guy or a girl, whatever, who is permanently controlled by artificial intelligence. And this is also an issue we have to reflect, how artificial intelligence creates a permanent control on workers. This is also a right to RGDP is partly answering this question, but probably not sufficiently. So this control, permanent control, is an issue we cannot ignore anymore. I think this is a serious a point which Costas, is that his name? Yes, has mentioned. I think we have to reflect on that.
Merci beaucoup. Il est 19h.
Thank you very much. It's 19:23. We have 7 minutes left. And we will use up all that time if you allow us. I'd like to open the floor for a last round of questions. That request goes out to those of you online. You can raise your hand or say in the chat. Leila in the room is also interested in putting a question. I'll give the floor to her first. If anyone in the chat wants to ask a question, then do let us know. We've got a few more minutes. Yes, I just wanted some clarification on your views on platform workers. You said that there are workers who want to be self-employed. But, I mean, we agree on this. We agree, broadly speaking, not just self-employed workers, and not just self-employed workers who work for a platform should have more rights. Access to collective bargaining, for example. The problem is, if we say that we have the status of worker and the status of self-employed, now, if you're truly self-employed, you cannot allow the platform to have power over the worker. Furthermore, if they're self-employed, and you said there is this this power which the platform has over the worker, is it not the platform's job to pay the social security and provide the protections? You made reference to it yourself. You saw in California, the platforms did all they could to reject their status as employers. But whether or not you're a worker or self-employed, if they're self-employed, that's fine. That's great. As you said, there are some workers where the platform is merely an intermediate, in which case there is no issue of unfair a power play there. But that's the question. I mean, how can we ensure that's the case? Thank you very much, Leila. I'll let you answer that, then I'll conclude.
Bon, je ne peux pas vous sortir maintenant.
Well, I mean, I can't produce a text for you here and now saying this is how we're going to do it. There's platforms and there's platforms. We agree on that. When we talk about platforms, what we are thinking of we're thinking about Uber or Deliveroo, that kind of thing. Here, I think there are some criteria which we need to determine the degree of autonomy of those who work on behalf of the platform. So we do need to identify whether there was a degree of subordination or not. There was a film which was made, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. I think it was on France 2, looking at platforms in France, where you can see just how the lengths they're willing to go to get around this issue of subordination. They draft their contracts, which is clearly a contract designed to introduce this imbalance of power, whilst using carefully chosen words to ensure that a judge won't say, well, this is a contract. And lots of judges do say this. I mean, even in California, the judges said this is an employee's contract. So we need to come up with criteria, and I can't tell you here and now how and when we're going to do this. We will work on it, we will think it over, but we need clarity. We need clarity now for the workers and more broadly speaking as well. If this is a grey area in labour law, and if this grey area means there are no social guarantees, social protection, if you believe that the self-employed worker who's working for a platform doesn't need, well, okay, we'll provide this protection on a voluntary basis. What will the consequences of this be for the workers' rights? A lot of businesses say, well, why does this part of my business, well, if that's possible, then I'll convert this part of my business into a platform, and then those who work there will no longer be employees, they'll be self-employed, working for a platform, and I just subcontract a certain set of activities. And that really is at the heart of our discussions, and we have to avoid that at all costs. Firstly, we don't want to turn back the clock in terms of social protection and remove all the labour laws we have in place. And secondly, there's an issue of competition as well. Because the person who sets up this, converts their business into a platform, will see an issue of social dumping. They'll have an advantage over the business which is kept to the old model. So this really is a fundamental question that strikes right at the heart of the nature of work, the nature of labour rights. I mean, you might well say today that platforms make up, I don't know, 5%. It's not a considerable figure of our businesses, but it is a model which will spread like wildfire if we do not regulate the model and ensure there's the same social protection, the same rights for employees as there are in a traditional business model. I think that's the issue. How are we going to tackle this question? Trust me, we are trying to find a solution, and we will of course stay in touch. You've made your own proposals. I can't sign off on them now saying yes, that's the solution, because there's an awful lot of work left to be done. We have to see how we move forward, okay? Thank you very much. Thank you for your honesty and for committing your time to this meeting. As you could see, all of our members are very interested in this issue. We expect a great deal of you. Not just our colleagues here who spoke tonight, those in EMPL and elsewhere. There are certain concerns, legitimate concerns about minimum wages, because we read the directive very attentively, and I think there were some unanswered questions, and that was the basis of the discussion we've had with you today. We have positive contributions to make, and we hope that further down the road we will be in a position to defend this measure as a step in the right direction towards a social Europe. At this stage, however, I don't think we can do that. We'll look at the final text, which will be discussed here in the Parliament. But we will be delighted if we're delighted to see that the Commission is truly tackling social issues, even if we think there is a lack of consistency. Well, we're looking at the European semester and other issues. But we know that we're working together on this side by side. We want to defend the measures we have in place to ensure social protection, and we don't want them to be shaken by the current health crisis. We'll have a 2-minute break now, and then we'll move on with the Sakharov Prize finalists.